chair if she can,
Remember, you changed
everybody please mute yourself. Please mute yourself. I'm going to ask the chair or Ms. Moss if she could read the roll.
Griffin,
Here.
McCormick,
Unmute.
Hey, I can't unmute myself, so I don't know why. I'm here.
Conwell, Hairston,
Here.
Bashir Jones,
Here.
Santana, Zone.
Present.
Mr. Chairman, you have a quorum.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to read this disclosure. The language for this is the Health and Human Services Committee hearing and meeting is being held during the COVID-19 emergency declaration in accordance with Ohio's open meetings laws, as amended by House Bill 197. This Senate Bill, House Bill 197. This meeting is being held using the Zoom platform and is being live streamed on YouTube and on Cleveland's Channel 20. It can also be seen on the Cleveland City Council website and from Council's Facebook page. In accordance with the Ohio Open Meetings Regulations as amended by HB 197, notice of this committee hearing was publicly posted. So briefly, just to give everybody how this operates, the committee hearing will be conducted as all committee hearings in accordance with Robert's Rules of Order. The chair will facilitate the meeting and call on persons to speak. If you wish to speak, please use the raise your hand option on Zoom. Please limit your comments to the matters before today's committee. As is usual practice, any action to be voted on during the committee will be done by voice vote, called and recorded by the committee clerk. Okay. So just to give you just to let you know what we're doing today, the virtual meetings in accordance with Ohio Meetings Law was amended with House Bill 197. Today we're hearing Resolution number 296-2020, introduced by Council members Blaine Griffin and Bashir Jones, an emergency resolution declaring racism a public health crisis and establishing a working group to promote racial equity in the city of Cleveland. I do want to note that Councilman Kerry McCormick, as well as Councilwoman Jasmine Santana, has also asked to help us and lead this and co-sponsor with this resolution. With that being said, just to let everyone know, today we have subject matter experts. We also have a member of the administration in the form of Chief of Public Affairs, Latoya Walker Minor. We'll hear from Chief Walker Minor and the mayor's administration regarding their comments regarding this resolution. And then we'll hear from our panelists and subject matter experts, which include a lot of the legacy civil rights organizations that we have in the city of Cleveland. Once again, I ask all of my colleagues that this is a vote that we will be taking. So I will inform everyone when we will take the vote. I plan on taking the vote to, while we make sure that all of us are satisfied with moving this forward. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Latoya Walker Minor for comments, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Arthur James, Margaret Mitchell, Marsha Maccabee, and Danielle Sidnor. Latoya Walker, you have the floor.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sure. Yeah. Good morning. On the heels of what we have witnessed over the last 4 to 5 days, the timeliness of this hearing could not be more appropriate. Health inequalities among racial minorities are pronounced, persistent, and pervasive. A century ago, Dr. W.B. Du Bois said the Negro death rate and sickness are largely matters of social and economic condition and not due to racial traits and tendencies. What Dr. Du Bois was talking about is what we now call the social determinants of health. This is caused from multiple dimensions of structural racism, the macro level systems and social forces, the institutional ideologies and processes that reinforce inequity. Structural may or may not be intended, but as the former Councilwoman Fannie Lewis said, whether you intended to run me down or not, I am run down. The results of inequalities are striking. They're abysmal. It results in infant mortality, heart disease, cancer, AIDS. 35 years ago, the former Health and Human Services Secretary Margaret Heckler in the Reagan administration met with Drs. Louis Sullivan, then the Dean of the Morehouse School of Medicine, Dr. David Satcher, who became the Director of the Centers for Controlled Disease and later the Surgeon General, Dr. Alfred Haynes of the Charles Drew School of Medicine, and Dr. Walter Bowie of Tuskegee. They were then leading the Association of Minority Health Schools. They released a report in 1980, A National Crisis and Time for Action. That report from 1980 called out the very same health disparities that disproportionately impact us today. Cardiovascular disease, cancer, chemical dependencies, diabetes, unintentional injury, infant mortality. That work led to the Heckler Report of 1984 and the establishment of the Offices of Minority Health. Today, the CDC is underscoring that we must think more broadly about public health. Our health, as they have documented, is determined in part by the social and economic opportunities and the lack of resources in our communities, in our homes, in our neighborhoods. Disparity reigns. And why are we looking at it through a public health lens? Because we know from Place Matters that there's an estimated 24-year difference in life expectancy in a 7-mile radius between Huff and Lyndhurst. Many of you recall that when we heard that at a city council hearing just a few years ago. But it is demonstrative of Place Matters. It is demonstrative of the social determinants of health. Do we need to be doing this work? Absolutely, we must. Because if we don't do this work, what we have witnessed, what is still going on in our communities right now today is from years of systemic oppression, lack of access and opportunity, structural racism, structural biases that continue to create and make racism a problem that completely impacts our health. And that is why we're talking about this today. I spoke with the mayor last week, and he said we need to be doing this work. He spoke about it in his State of the City last October, and that is why we are here. We are here to join hands with you as we move forward and look at policies, look at resources, look at strategies so that we can improve the health conditions in our community, for our community, across our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Walker. And once again, I'm going to ask everyone if they could hold comments, let the presenters present first. I do have a prearranged schedules of speakers of people who have asked to speak as well. So I want everybody to make sure that we do keep a good time limit as well. I'm going to pivot now to the legacy organizations, and I believe that is Ms. Maccabee or Ms. Mitchell going to see that up? Present first. Did everybody please mute yourself? Okay, go ahead, Ms. Maccabee. Either you or Ms. Mitchell, or who's going to kick it off?
Councilman Chairman Griffith, I think that's me to start things off.
Okay, Dr. James, you're it.
Yes.
And announce
good
who you
morning.
are and your organization as well.
Sure. So good morning, Chairman Griffith, Chief Walker, members of City Council, and others that are part of this morning's meeting. My name is Arthur James. I am an obstetrician, gynecologist, and pediatrician who serves this community as a consultant to First Year Cleveland. And it is my pleasure to be part of this community's request that the Cleveland City Council declare racism a public health crisis. I've been asked to take about 5 minutes to summarize how we have arrived at such a moment and why we are making this request. Our nation's history of managing race is at the root of why we are here. The first Africans who were enslaved in America arrived 401 years ago and endured slavery for 246 years. Slavery was followed by 99 years of Jim Crow. Today, these two periods of time account for 345 of the 401 years since the onset of African-American slavery. This 345 years represents 86% of the African-American experience. That means that 86% of the time our nation intentionally and preferentially provided significant advantage to our citizens who were white while simultaneously, intentionally, and preferentially subjecting those of us who are Black to disadvantage. Keep in mind that both advantage and disadvantage accumulate over time, yet whenever we compare the circumstances between Blacks and whites, we never acknowledge this history. Instead, we behave as if the disparate outcomes experienced by Blacks and whites occur because of group level flaws amongst those of us who are Black. In 1964, our nation passed the Civil Rights Act. Although intended to begin the process of leveling the racial playing field, our nation's history of redlining, mass incarceration, voter suppression, gerrymandering, gentrification, racial bias in hiring, firing, and education, and our national, statewide, and local racially biased policies, practices, and systems have guaranteed that the temporary gains made by the civil rights movement have mostly been undone. The consequences of these institutionalized racist policies can be seen in the formation of blighted Black neighborhoods, higher rates of unemployment, poverty, hunger, undereducation, homelessness, lower rates of home ownership. And all of this leads to compromised health and lowered life expectancy. In short, we have created a society that undermines opportunities for Black people in virtually every domain of life. Cleveland has been hit hard by this history. Because infant mortality is one of the most reliable and universally accepted measures of the quality of one's life, allow me to use infant mortality as an example of disparate impact of centuries of racism. Nationally, Black babies die at 2 times the rate of white babies. In Ohio, Black babies die at 3 times the rate of white babies. In Cuyahoga County, Black babies die at 4 times the rate of white babies. And in the city of Cleveland, Black babies die at 7 times the rate of white babies, despite the fact that Cleveland is home to medical facilities that are worldwide destinations for care. Dr. Nancy Krieger, a Harvard professor, tells us that, and I quote, "Social inequality kills. It deprives individuals and communities of a healthy start in life, increases their burden of disability and disease, and brings early death. Poverty and discrimination, inadequate medical care, and the violation of human rights all act as powerful social determinants of who lives and who dies, at what age, and with what degree of suffering," end quote. Today, we are living through a period of time when the consequences of this inequality has been exposed by the Black-white disparities in death and economic despair as a consequence of the coronavirus pandemic, and the eruption of protest across our nation because of frustration and anger regarding our country's historical indifference to the mistreatment and killings of unarmed Black people by law enforcement. It should also be made clear that while the emphasis of our conversation this morning revolves around the racial disparities between whites and Blacks, we acknowledge that we are just as concerned about the racism that Latinx, Native Americans, immigrants, and other people of color are also subjected to. In 1903, W.E.B. Du Bois told us that in the United States, quote, "The problem of the 20th century is the color line," end quote. The color line remains the problem in the 21st century. In 1968, the Kerner Commission warned us that, quote, our nation was moving toward two societies, one white, one black, separate and unequal, end quote. 52 years later, we are now separate and unequal enough that we reside in an apartheid America. It is time that we acknowledge the problem and the cumulative disparate impact it has on people of color. We propose beginning the elimination of this problem by declaring racism a public health crisis. Thank you. I now turn the floor over to Mrs. Maccabee.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, council members, and all within the hearing of my voice. The Urban League of Greater Cleveland is honored to be a part of this movement to declare racism as a public health issue in the city of Cleveland. My role today is to shine the light on why now, and I submit to you, as has been said already by other speakers before me, timing is everything. I want to point out 3 factors that I believe are really moving support for us and creating momentum for us to move forward our city's request to make racism a public health issue in Cleveland. And I want to commend our Councilman Griffin, all the co-sponsors, and all of those in the founding committee who have been working on this issue to bring it to this point. So what do we have now in terms of timing that really give us additional momentum to move forward? The first is the convergence of the recognition of inequities across multiple systems. COVID-19 shined the light on pre-existing disparities in a way that nothing else could have. It shined the light on the disparity in the economic system. It shined the light on the disparity in the health system. As we looked at numbers of African-American individuals who were getting the coronavirus and dying from it in disproportionate numbers to the majority community, the light was shed on the fact that disparities in the ability to access healthcare because of financial constraints put people in susceptible positions to be able to become victims of coronavirus in an inequitable way. When we look at the economic front, the unemployment rate in the African-American community was last looked at in April at 17%, and now moving, we expect, to near 20%. This is a factor of the number of individuals in our community who are working 2 to 3 jobs to make ends meet. Often then meaning that when the governor's guidelines came down, the guidelines for staying at home and sheltering at home, it meant that in many cases, in our poorest communities, not only was a job lost, but sometimes 2 or 3 jobs were lost, really impacting the economic fiber and really broadening the disparity in economics. We also looked at, in the education realm, the lack of access to technology and broadband meant that children in poor communities, yes, our children, were not able to pivot to the online learning opportunities provided by K-12 and higher ed systems in the same way that others with access to those very tools were able to do. So again, it means that the children in the African American community and also in other minority communities without access to those tools are going to fall behind again at a higher rate. All of these disparities, as was mentioned earlier in Ms. Walker Minor's comments, are part of the social determinants of health and make a big difference. So, and then finally, I don't think anyone on this call doesn't have a feeling today of concern for what's happening in our country, even right here in our own city over the weekend, with respect to what's happening with the safety forces across our country. The cry that was heard, not only across this country, but now even across the world, when George Floyd said, "I can't breathe." We have been experiencing in our communities for far too long the inability to breathe because the systems have not been accessible to us in the same way that they have for others, relegating us to ways in our lives and in our livelihoods that are less equitable than for others. Finally, I will say that a third reason is that others are doing it. Others are raising their voices now around making racism a public health issue in our state, across our country. And so the momentum has been set. And I will tell you that just over this weekend, here at the Urban League of Greater Cleveland, we have received at least 50 calls from organizations and individuals saying, what is it that we can do? And these are non-minority organizations to assist in this time. And one of the things that I'm answering is you need to come aboard with our movement to make racism a public health issue and to commit to address your system that you're a part of, because the only way that systemic change is going to happen is when we disrupt all of the practices and the procedures that have been allowed to go on in systems that have kept the inequities in place. So we encourage, again, from the Urban League of Greater Cleveland and all of our constituents, that we go forward with declaring racism as a public health issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mockabee. And just for the record, if I'm not mistaken, Dr. James and Ms. Mockabee, you guys are going to send me and Ms. Tilley your remarks for the record for this hearing.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. I believe now we're going to hear from Ms. Mitchell and then Danielle Sidnor. Is Ms. Mitchell on?
I'm not.
Is Margaret Mitchell on? Could we make sure we unmute our guest so that make sure that all of our guests are unmuted?
I'm representing myself as a African-American mother of sons and daughters, a wife, a human being, mourning with all of you and mourning with our city. I'm here to share my remarks regarding declaring racism a public health crisis and why and what this will mean. I first want to say that this is really an approach. It is a bold approach, a new approach. It is one that the city of Cleveland has already started in so many different areas. But when Black and brown and white people ask me, so what? What does this mean, declaring racism a public health crisis? I want you to know that this is the moment to start telling the truth. This is the moment to make change. This is the moment to make a difference. Dr. James walked through the African-American experience here in the United States. And I would say that the slave mentality has never left America. And we have continued to see that play out. This resolution, while much work is still yet to be done, work through a work group, I would say that it is very important for us to understand that this resolution is an opportunity to evaluate, bring awareness, make change, and most importantly, create accountability. Yes, it will be key to disaggregate the data racially. We've seen how important that has been in understanding the trends around the COVID-19 pandemic. But it'll also be important to create an accreditation rating system that will be monitored by a community board. It will also be important for us to take a wide swath looking at all of the areas that touch public health. They include education, community development, health, mental health and well-being, environment, criminal justice, jobs, employment, and housing. As my sister Marcia Maccabee indicated, the history of economic downturns, recessions, and depressions are periods of time when America does not put every American back to work as part of the focus to get America back on its feet. And we know that even right now, at this very moment, captains of industry in this city and in this country are moving to ensure the future. But I can promise you, they are not thinking about how to put Black and brown people and people of color back to work first. What you are about to embark on is going to be challenging, is going to be dangerous. Some would say nearly impossible. What you are about to embark on has 400 years currently pressing on it to ensure that what you want to do does not happen. We must do this. We cannot turn back. We are standing on the edge of a cliff at this very moment. We must look forward. We have to have the courage and the boldness to do it, even knowing that the cost is going to be dear. There is no way forward but forward. And so I implore you, with all boldness and courage, to not look back, but ever forward to what must be done for and with this community. To declare racism a public health crisis and begin the deep and detailed process of coalescing the work, some work that is already being done, but bringing others into the fold to create a new and equitable future for Cleveland, our state, and our country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mitchell. The last person I believe we have from the legacy organizations is the president of the NAACP, Danielle Sidnor. Ms. Sidnor, are you on?
Yes, I'm on. Can you all hear me?
Yes, you have the floor.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you to Blaine, the chair, the sponsors of this important resolution, to the committee and leaders that are making this happen today. I will keep my remarks very brief because I think many of the leaders that have expressed the similar concerns that I have as president for the Cleveland branch of the NAACP, they've expressed the reasons that we must move forward with this resolution. You know, as we look at the complexity of the current state of affairs of our country, I think that we are required as leaders to move forward with the courage that has been bestowed upon us from those that began this fight long before we were ever here. And I think that the activities that we've experienced over the last several days really illuminate the reason that it's not one singular incident of violence or racism that causes unrest, but it is a system that we must work to dismantle. And I, again, appreciate the leaders that are taking a very important step forward by declaring racism as a public health crisis. Today, many Black people are at work, but they are logged in, but they're checked out mentally because of the stress and the anguish and the trauma that comes from dealing with these microaggressions, blatant racism on a day-to-day basis. Unfortunately, we're often taught that we must just let it go. We have to pick our battles. We have to move on and act like things didn't happen. And so by declaring racism as a public health crisis, it now puts us all in a position where leaders in corporate spaces, in philanthropic spaces, and government spaces can really begin to join and lock arms with us and be prepared on how to handle and work with their staff, their employees, their vendors, people that they may engage with that are dealing with trauma when these incidents continue to happen. I just continue to call upon all that are watching to find their place in this work. The resolution will just be a document, but the action will come from the community and the citizens and the leaders that activated it and make it a real thing. So again, we thank you for the leadership in bringing this together, and the organizations that are initially signing on continue to welcome others to join us in working to make this a reality for our city, so that we can move the region forward and continue to be the leaders that we are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Sidnor. I also want to acknowledge that we do have with us the head of first year Cleveland, Bernadette Kerrigan. And then we also have Catrice Kane. I think she's on here somewhere. And I'm not sure if I'm missing anybody, but I know that they're very actively a part of pushing this agenda and this work forward as well. With that being said, I just want to make a couple of, I have several council colleagues that have asked to make remarks, and because of schedule is starting to pick up again with all of the council members, some do have to leave. But I do want to make a couple of statements. One is this 296-2020 was actually introduced, is formally introduced on March 2nd, 2020. It was formally introduced on March 2nd, 2020. So Cleveland actually was really stepping out on the lead of this a long time ago. However, the COVID crisis hit soon thereafter. This group also has come and give hearings and have met with us regularly. So this isn't something that we're just reacting towards, the tragedies that we've seen over the last week with George Floyd, and also the other, tragedies that we've seen in our city and across the nation this past week. So this is something that we want to institutionalize. We want to institutionalize equity. We want to make sure that we work closely with the internal and external partnership, because City Hall can't do this alone. I also want to tell you that we've done some research with GARE and GARE is an organization that most government entities come under that deal with racial equity. I think it's a Government Alliance on Racial Equity. That's what GARE stands for, Government Alliance on Racial Equity. So Ms. Ann Tilley and myself and others have been looking at that. I also want to acknowledge, and I know that he's probably going to make some comments about his role in this. Councilman Matt Zone, as when he was chair of the National League of City, set up a committee called REAL, Racial Equity and Leadership. And myself and the co-sponsor of this legislation, Bashir Jones, sit on that committee. So I want to make sure that people understand, as well as policy. Council has put, very innovative lead legislation in order to try to deal with the exposure with lead. We have done with other housing instability issues like right to assistance, right to representation. That was led by Councilman Brancatelli and Councilman Kelly, Council President Kelly. And we've also, done some other things like decriminalize marijuana in the city of Cleveland. So this council has been active on social justice and civil rights issues. And this, what we want to do is to be the umbrella to really tie all of these efforts together so that we can have a measurable impact on racism in our society. The voices of the disparaged really cried out over our nation this past week. And as government officials, we have to listen. But I don't want people to think that we're just reacting, because we've been part of this work since day one. With that being said, I'll hold the rest of my comments until the end, because I want to pivot to my colleagues. The first person that I want to acknowledge is the co-sponsor of this legislation. And I know that a couple of people have asked to be added, Councilwoman Santana, as well as Councilman Hairston. But the co-sponsors are Councilman Bashir Jones, who I'll come up next, and then Councilman Kerry McCormick, who is the Vice Chair of the Public Health Committee. So with that being said, Councilman Bashir Jones, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Chair. I truly appreciate the work that's being done. And ever since, and thank you to Council President Kevin Kelly, ever since that I came on council, my goal was to continue my activism and to fight to remove structural racism from a city that I love so much. I appreciate, done my camp outs, and my guy, Councilman Casey, in the middle of the night, you see this guy walking down the street that usually you wouldn't see, and came to stand with me. Or the conversations that I would have with Kerry McCormick, who's been a major partner, and at times when I felt people didn't hear me, he was someone that I could lean on. And I thank Council President Kevin Kelly for all the late night conversations we would have about this topic of racism. And I'm just very appreciative of the work of Councilman Zone and others. And I'm appreciative of every last one of you who have been a part of this fight, Councilman Conwell, and of course my good friend Hairston, and so forth and so on. This is a city that I love so much. It's a city that at one point was on the world stage for its advances and for the people it produced. And our city has so much potential, and I truly believe that we have the potential to return to the international stage for the most positive things, but we must acknowledge the impact that structural racism has had on our city. Our country is burning. Our country is burning. All over America, cities are being torched. Buildings are being burned down. Windows are being busted. But this is the language of the unheard. in the words of Dr. King, the frustration. And for the past couple of months, everyone has been quarantined out of fear of spreading the COVID-19 virus, but the virus of racism has made the virus of COVID-19 almost obsolete. But thousands of people are marching and coming together. The virus of police brutality, officers killing unarmed civilians on camera and getting a slap on the wrist, getting desk duty, and returning to serve the very communities they just unleashed their hatred on. America is burning, but not in the way that it needs to. The structures and systems of racism must be burned down. And I won't allow anyone to turn the conversation into busted windows, when the real conversation is, why is it that George Floyd is not an isolated incident? Why is it in Cleveland, Ohio, a young man by the name of Desmond Franklin who was shot and killed by an off-duty police officer, and we still have not seen any charges? How is it possible that a cop can shoot and kill Tamir Rice, and then we still have to battle with whether or not we can fire him and remove him from the force? We are tired of dying. We are tired of dying. We are tired of watching a country that we helped build not protect us. You know, ever since I became a councilman, I've had to ask tough questions. And maybe you thought it was a joke when I asked, why in the world does this big old painting in the city council chambers have no representation of our city? Maybe you thought I was playing. Maybe you thought it didn't have an impact of how these things send subconscious racism, how it makes Black and brown people feel inferior and make others feel superior. You see, the power of racism is this. Racism is not just being led by blatantly racist white people, but sometimes it can become a tool of well-intentioned white people. It can become a tool of Black people as well. The oppression of Black and brown people is not just at the hands of white people, but also at the hands of Black people as well. So even though this is a majority Black city, we also represent the majority of its poverty. This is not a Black issue. The moment that America recognizes that racism is not just a Black issue, that's when we're going to move forward. Racism is a human issue. Racism is killing us. It is killing our unborn children. It is killing our sons and daughters. It is killing our elders. It is killing us financially. It is killing us educationally. This legislation has to be more than a piece of paper. Cleveland must dedicate itself to healing the city by taking action steps to truly bring equity. Our mayor has been speaking about equity. But we must implement practices that bring equity. We can't say equity, but still have a police force that is 60% white men. We can't say equity and still have a fire department that's 75% white men. We can't say equity when we have jails that are majority Black and brown. And these are just words and these are just documents. We must seriously diversify our safety forces. Culturally incompetent people will never be able to secure people that they don't care to understand. There must be equity in our hiring practices. Our hospitals and health facilities must be held accountable in how they're servicing Black and brown people. How many of our Black women have to die after being sent home because doctors don't understand how to serve them? From bail to jail, how are we ensuring that we are promoting human rights and rehabilitation? This must be more than a piece of paper. Cleveland must dedicate itself and dedicates its resources to ensuring that all people can benefit from the American dream. I know some of you need data, I know, but for some of us, our lives have been the data. Our lives have been the data. Our experience have been the data. And the trauma is real. The trauma is real. So the burning buildings that you see is just a small symptom of our pain. And as we know, we saw those white male thugs come and destroy our city. We saw those white male savages come and destroy our city. But burning buildings is just a symptom of our pain. And I don't want our city to burn. As I'm saying to everyone, as I close, everyone who can hear my voice, destroying buildings does not honor the legacy of George Floyd. Destroying buildings does not honor the legacy of Tamir Rice and Desmond Franklin and all of the Black men and women who have died at the hands of not just police brutality, but also the brutality of its own community. It does not honor us when you do this. But more importantly, we must burn the system of structural racism. I'm tired of seeing families not get the justice they deserve. So the question we must ask ourselves truthfully is, will this document heal our trauma and provide the necessary reparations that we need, or is it just talk? And I can promise you, as long as I'm here, it won't be just talk. I thank you so much, Chairman, Council President. I thank you. And I thank every organization that's here. And as we look at the organizations that can assist us, let's be real. Some organizations have had an opportunity to make a change and they have not, and they should not be allowed at the table, and they will be called out because many of them are assisting in the destruction of our community. Chairman Griffin, thank you so much. God bless you.
Thank you so much, Councilman Jones. And we know that this has been something that you've been passionate about since you've been on council, and I'm proud that we're able to really put forth this legislation. And you're right, the work begins once we pass this resolution. So thank you for being a co-sponsor. Thank you for really, providing leadership on this. And I really appreciate working with you on this whole process. Thank you. Next up, I have another co-sponsor and also the vice chair of the committee, which is Councilman Kerry McCormick, who's a co-sponsor, downtown councilman, and the co-sponsor for this. And then after that, I have Matt Zone, who is asked to make a couple of remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you hosting this conversation. To all our guests today for taking the time out to be a part of this conversation and really reading this legislation. I've got to tell you, having listened to Councilman Jones, I'm sitting here, I feel like I have nothing to add. That was such an incredible statement by Councilman Jones. And so I want to endorse and really put an exclamation point on his statement. Really, truly moving, Councilman Jones. And so I just wanted to respond to that and emphasize that. Mr. Chairman, I'm a proud co-sponsor of 296-2020 that we introduced in March. As Ms. Sidnor just said a few minutes ago, find your place in this work. That statement really struck me. Find your place in this work. As Councilman Jones referenced, systemic racism is not an issue for one community or the other. And really, Mr. Chairman, that is how I see this issue. We know that systemic racism impacts our Black community and other communities of color in a very acute way, much more than it affects at all for folks that look like me. But what we all need to understand and talk about on a daily basis is the impact that systemic racism has on our society as a whole. Yes, absolutely. Systemic racism targets certain people in our community for the color of their skin, but no one should mistake the fact that when certain folks in our society are imposed this disease on them, when we impose this disease on them, it takes down our whole society. This is about the well-being of our country. This is about the well-being of our community. And when we have a naked and blatant disease like this, it is our responsibility to take it on, not only for our friends and neighbors and brothers and sisters who are most impacted by it. But it's our responsibility to take it on for the well-being of our entire society. We will not improve. We will not get better. We will not move our society forward in a meaningful way if we don't A, acknowledge and confront this issue, and B, use what we are doing moving forward in viewing the issues in our community through this lens. And I think that that's another important point on this, Mr. Chairman. This is not about one solution. Are there specific things that we need to do? Absolutely. As you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, there are steps we've taken in our city, whether it be infant mortality, whether it be right to counsel or decriminalizing certain aspects of our law. But no one issue will, fight systemic racism by itself. We have to view our community through the lens in which this disease and plague has blanketed our society. So, Mr. Chairman, I am here to fully endorse and support this legislation. I am here to support the moving testimony from my colleague, Councilman Jones, from you yourself and the other folks on council. I am so appreciative of the brilliant minds that we have in this group that will be addressing this issue. And finally, Mr. Chairman, as I've said before, this is about public conversations. This is about legislation. This is about policy change. But what is so important out of all of this is that people that look like me, when they are at their kitchen tables or when they are in private conversations, in intimate private conversations, they are having this conversation with their friends and family. We have to change the hearts and minds of Americans. We have to change the hearts and minds of people that look like me in order to fight this disease of systemic racism on all fronts. So yes, we have to make public statements. Yes, we have to pass laws, but in the most intimate spaces, we need to be discussing this disease and how together we can defeat it and make progress. So we all have to be a part of the solution here, Mr. Chairman. Find your place in this work. We've all got to do that, and we all have to be responsible. All of us have to be responsible for taking on systemic racism. So thank you all so much. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of this legislation.
Thank you so much, Councilman McCormick, and I appreciate you being a co-sponsor. I know that several other people have asked to be co-sponsors, and we have several council members on the floor. But I do want to acknowledge that Councilman Hairston, as well as Majority Leader Councilwoman Phyllis Cleveland, will also like to be added. At some point in time, I will talk with Rachel because I believe that all council members seem to want to be involved with this. I would also be remiss if I did not acknowledge the other council persons that are here. We have Anthony Hairston, we have Anthony Brancatelli, Ward 12, Anthony Hairston, Ward 10, Jasmine Santana, Ward 14, Matt Zone, Ward 15, Brian Casey, Ward 16, Charles Slife, Ward 17, Phyllis Cleveland, Ward 5, Kevin Conwell, Ward 9, and we also have the Council President Kevin Kelly. If you have questions for our panelists, if you want to know how this looks and how this works, please make sure that you write your questions down. I am trying to adhere to a 10-minute max comment section because we have so many people, and I'm going to also call for the vote as soon as we hear from the rest of our colleagues. So that being said, I have Councilman Matt Zone, who is up next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. I'll be well under 10 minutes. First of all, thank you for your leadership and to my other council colleagues. And I'm so appreciative of all of the allies and partners and legacy organizations that are on this call today. I too would like to be added as a co-sponsor, and I just have a brief remark that I'd like to just put into the record. You know, racism, I don't need to tell those on this call, but hopefully those who are listening, racism in America continues to rub salt in the wounds of that have been endured not only over generations, but centuries. And it's a stark reminder that there's still so much more work that needs to be done on the long and difficult road of racial healing. But while racism is undeniably a part of America's past, it has no place in our country's future. Racism has no place in our society, period, no matter what name it travels under. White supremacy, white nationalism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia. Racialized hate is a virus that robs us of our safety and our freedom. And overcoming this evil is going to be a defining challenge. As Ms. Mitchell said, it's going to be hard work for for Clevelanders and for city leaders across our great country. You know, this is a time for us to stand up because we know our communities best. Our constituents are looking us as a convener. They're looking to us as a healer. They're looking to us as a listener and as a protector. And today, by passage of this legislation, we are convening an important conversation. We can start to heal 400 years of pain. We can be a good listener and listen to the thoughts of our community. But we can also be a protector by making this declarative statement and putting it on the record that we will not tolerate racism in the city of Cleveland. I'm so grateful to our ally organizations that have already taken this action. I've been heartened to see so many of our colleagues speaking out and taking stance against racism. Starting today, the fight to defend an inclusive, diverse, and a free society begins with the passage of this legislation. And I'm confident working with our faith community, social activists, businesses, and others, we can send a clear message that we will not tolerate racism in our city. I appreciate Councilman Griffin acknowledging the work of the National League of Cities. GARE has been a strong, longtime ally partner of the National League of Cities. We too have a wonderful initiative, which is the REAL initiative, and I'm so thankful for Councilman Griffin and Councilman Bashir Jones serving on our task force, which stands for Race, Equity, and Leadership. I would, Mr. Chairman, ask if we could add one item to our work agenda. And I just want to highlight some important work that is being partnered with our health department and our Office of Sustainability. Councilman Tony Brancatelli and myself have been working around an environmental justice and cumulative impact legislation that will ensure that old legacy industries don't continue to plague and crop up in poor communities, and that there's real accountability in this space. So I look forward to bringing my expertise, working with Councilman Brancatelli and others to make environmental justice cumulative impact part of our work agenda. Thank you for your leadership, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much, Councilman Zone. I really appreciate your leadership on this as well. Next up, I have Council President Kevin Kelly, and then I have Councilwoman Jasmine Santana. Any council person that would like to make a statement or ask our guests any questions, please raise your hand in the chat box.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to you for your leadership on this and everybody that's come together to make this reality. I just wanted to make a comment, something that Councilman Bashir Jones said kind of like, stuck with me. Well, a lot of it did, but there's one thing in particular. Disparities in health outcomes are complicated. Why is it that certain groups have higher rates of diabetes, of heart disease, of cancer? It's complicated to unpack that. But through the work of First Year Cleveland, it really just laid bare, you take every other factor away. You take away poverty, you take away access to healthcare, income, you strip away all other factors, and the only thing that we're left with is race. And it is the factor that causes disparities in infant mortalities and in birth outcomes. So this has really been very, enlightening. And to Councilman Bashir Jones' point, I hear you loud and clear where, we don't need data to tell us this stuff. I've lived it. I appreciate that. But my God, if you're looking for data, the birth outcome data by First Year Cleveland dispels any argument to the contrary that there's anything else that is causing the disparity in birth outcomes between white mothers, Black mothers, and Hispanic mothers. The data is painful. It is there, it is obvious, and it is something that we cannot ignore. So while I hear Councilman loud and clear that we don't need data, if we did need it for something, we've got it. And it should be, every time we see the data, every time we have our First Year Cleveland meetings, it's always shocking. And even when we improve the total number of babies that died before the first birthday, we still have not solved the disparity between white mothers and Black mothers. And it is something that is just really, again, I can't tell you for sure what the different factors are that lead to higher rates of diabetes. I can't tell you for sure what leads to higher rates of heart disease for certain demographics. I can tell you for absolute positive that if you are a Black woman and you're pregnant, you're gonna have a child, that child is much less likely to live to its first birthday based on the race of the mother. And most shockingly, this isn't an international problem. This only happens in the United States. It happens here. So I think that when this resolution came forward, and I remember at one of the board meetings talking about this, and it was kind of like, will the state do something? And the conclusion was just, we can't wait for other people. And I would just urge my colleagues, we can't wait for the state to do anything. We can't wait for somebody else to do it. And so I appreciate everybody who is on in this meeting right now, everybody that helped organize the 400 Years of Racism conference, everything that is like really all the steps taken to shine a light on this. So I would just conclude by saying, thank Councilman Jones for your testimony. I hear you loud and clear that your life experience is more important than any data. But in the world we live in of government grants and everything we do, if we need data, for God's sakes, we've got it, and it is unignorable, if that's a word. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Council President. Another person who is very active in this space and has really shown a lot of leadership around this, and she and I have had several conversations around this, as well as others in the Hispanic community, has been Councilwoman Jasmine Santana. Councilwoman Jasmine Santana, you have the floor.
Could you hear me?
Yep, we got you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Chair, and all my colleagues. This is a very emotional, sensitive topic, and I am honored to be a co-sponsor. I'm trying to process, everything that my colleagues have said and everything that we've gone, have just witnessed and experienced through, our lifetime. So it's a lot to take in. I'm not gonna repeat a lot of what my colleagues said. I think all of them have expressed, structural racism and in an accurate way. I think we all know that, the problem and the challenges, structural racism is definitely killing our minorities, not only by police, but, chronic disease, homelessness, mental health, trauma, so on, so forth. And there's definitely an urgency for action. And, I agree with my colleague Bashir, that this has to be beyond a piece of paper. There definitely needs to be some action, some innovative action, because I think there's a lot of groups out there that are doing really good work to address a structural racism. However, it's not improving lives. So how do we get together and work innovatively to really impact, people's lives? And here's some data. As you guys know, I do serve a community that's primarily Latinos, but they're 70% minorities. And out of the 70% minorities, I would tell you that living under poverty is under 200% poverty is 71% of that. And so with my leadership and coming in here, it's been about investing in people, right? And I know we talk a lot about community development and bricks and mortars, but you know, how do we really invest in people and help them build equity? Where we're improving lives, we're improving, you know, the mental health status and building wealth within the minority community. I will tell you, as a Latina, I'm gonna put this out there, you know, I feel that we are definitely privileged when it compares to the Black community. But that doesn't mean that we don't feel the pain. And our racism, of course, is a lot with, you know, on our immigrant population, our undocumented. We see it every day, you know, here in our neighborhood. And I think and I'm putting myself out there, you know, as an elected official, sometimes I feel helpless. Like I feel that, you know, are we doing enough to address the issue? Are we holding people in leadership positions accountable for what they're doing within the police department, within the firefighters, within, you know, organizations that serve low-income families, you know, and are supposed to help them with federal funding or, you know, food stamps and all that? Because I hear this from families every day, how they are treated. And there's no doubt that there was a righteous anger and frustration for not being heard, because for years, these people are being treated so unfairly. And they're so tired of it. It's like a kid, right? Trying to tell you something constantly, and you're ignoring them. And what do? They do they throw a tantrum. And that's the way that people are feeling right now. So I'm just feeling the pain. My son has taken it very, very hard. You know, kids are paying attention. So I think, as, you know, elected officials, as new leaders, you know, we definitely have to help and improve this so for the next generation, because I don't want to be worried about my son and what could happen to him, because, right, he at times look Black, right? He has, you know, the curly hair. He doesn't look as Latino. So I worry about him. And as a mom, I'm worried about this situation. I'm worried about our youth. So, you know, everything was said. I'm just here to work. I'm a doer. I don't like talk much. So you just count on me for whatever you need. And I thank you for putting this meeting together. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Councilwoman Santana. And thank you for your leadership for the entire community. Sometimes that is an awesome responsibility, because people look at you as for leadership for our entire region as being a Hispanic leader. Next up, I have Councilman Kevin Conwell, and then I am going to call for the vote. But then we're going to continue. So if any other council members or myself have questions for our panelists, I want us to do that. But I want to make sure we get Councilman Kevin Conwell, and then we're going to call for the vote. Some council members have some obligations, so I want to hear from Councilman Conwell, and then please hang out right after him. We're going to call for the vote while we have everyone here, and then we're going to continue with other questions for our panelists. Councilman Kevin Conwell.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
You know, we're doing a lot of work in our ward and in the Glenville community. And just a month ago, you know what, maybe 3 weeks ago, I reached out to Latoya Walker-Minor and Valerie McCall, Chief Valerie McCall, and I want to thank them. They helped me out. I talked with my residents. We were going to block up Eastern 105 because they're doing construction on 105, and I noticed, and I was watching, because I believe in actions speak louder than words. There was no African Americans and no females working on that project. And when I see that in my neighborhood, especially coming from public dollars, I get my residents together, and I reached out to Big Norman Edwards. And I said, Norman, let's block up East 105th Street. Let's give the administration 2 weeks to make this happen, because I believe in Mayor Frank Jackson and his chief of staff, that they would take care of it. We were looking to block up East 105th Street until they put some African Americans or female workers or African-American female workers on that project, because
Councilman, you broke up.
I want to thank them. Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
You hear me?
yes.
Okay, I want to thank the administration. Now, when my residents walk down East 105th Street, now when they see the project, this $15 million project, we see African Americans working there so that they can take care of their families also. So when we push a document like this, you have to manage legislation, but we have to also manage it in our own wards. Actions speak louder than words. The other piece that we missed on was the Fannie M. Lewis law. We should have been down there, downstate, battling for that Fannie M. Lewis law to not to go away. When our residents see that we're out there fighting for them, then they start believing in us even more, and they join into the fight. The other piece we have to be careful downstate in Columbus, and we need to go down there to make sure that that policy does not pass, is the stand your ground law. We lose out if that stand your ground law pass. I want to thank Council for pushing the resolution. I want to thank Bishop Ward and some of the other people that went down there with me in December, and we fought against stand your ground law. However, Mr. Chairman, as council members, we got to fight against those things. And we got to fight anywhere and everywhere possible. When you let some things get, let's say, slip through the cracks, then people will start taking us for granted. So we'll push this legislation, and I want to sign on to the legislation also as a co-sponsor. But for me, as Councilwoman Jasmine Santana just narrated to actions speak louder than words. Thank you very, very much, and God bless.
Thank you so much, Councilman Conwell. I really appreciate it. I have to apologize to everybody. I also have one more member of the committee that would like to make a remark, and that's Councilman Anthony Hairston. And then my commitment after Councilman Hairston, because I want to give every committee member on the Health Committee a chance. And then I'll take questions from my other colleagues, Councilman Hairston, and then we're going to take the vote. Councilman Hairston.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll be brief. I know we are on a time crunch, but I will want to say again, as I said when this was introduced back in March, this is long overdue. About damn time that we are taking the necessary steps to declare this a public health crisis. Something that I believe this has been on the hearts and minds for many of us for so long. But again, as you said, Mr. Chairman, this is not just a knee-jerk reaction to the incidents that we have seen recently across the US and across the world, but this is something that this body has been working, who has been planning, who has been devising an initiative and a plan to deal with for quite some time. And so I commend Councilman Bashir Jones in Ward 7, who has continuously been speaking publicly and openly and consistently about this issue, as well as our chairman, Councilman Griffin. I am happy to be a co-sponsor of this legislation to move this forward. But Mr. Chairman, to those who are listening, those who are watching from afar, for me, it's about the next steps, that this does not become another piece of legislation that sits in our books, that has no teeth, that is no action followed by the conversations, the comments, the testimonies that we are hearing today, but that there is true action to what we want to see happen here. That we all get off of our laurels and that we all get off of our butts and begin to do the work that we all know that should have been done. So, Mr. Chairman, count me in on this fight to see that our community, our region, our nation begins to heal from the structural racism that we all have experienced. And I understand some of the comments about data, because there's no data that can explain the pain or the circumstances that myself and that many others who look like me have been through. There's no greater data than that. There's no greater data than that. The white sheets are fine. The pieces of paper, the statistics are fine. That helps those who truly don't understand what us and our community are faced with. But it is us who has to explain to our young Black children, Black boys and Black girls, as we see in Atlanta, who was in tears, marching and walking with those who are peacefully protesting due to the things that we have seen with George Floyd and others, and Desmond Franklin here in Cleveland have gone through, have experienced. That is what we have to fight for. That is what this legislation, to me and my thoughts, is for. It is for those young Black kids and brown kids who have to watch and endure what is going on, not only here in Cleveland, but across our world. And so, Mr. Chairman, I know I said I'll be brief because I can continue. But again, it is about action from this point on, that we do not, and I repeat, that we do not pass a piece of legislation that would just sit on our books and mean nothing. So, Mr. Chairman, count me in again, as I said, in this fight, that we work through these trying times in our community and that we begin to see action and results as we go through this process. So thank you again, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilman Brink. Thank you so much, Councilman Harrison. I appreciate your passion around this as well. I'm going to call for a voice vote, and just want to let everybody know, because this is a virtual meeting, it will be a voice vote. At this time, we won't be signing resolution until we all convene personally as council members. As everybody knows, we do our business in the city of Cleveland on a different schedule now because of COVID-19. But today we will ratify this vote with a voice acclamation. With that being said, all in favor of passing resolution number 296, 2020, introduced March 2nd, 2020, declaring racism as a public health crisis, signal by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? The ayes have it. Any discussion? Okay, what we're going to do is the legislation passes 296, 2020.
Council Chairman, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
I want to meet with you about the Dred Scott decision also.
Okay, we're going to stay on. We're staying on this call. The call is not ending.
That's in there because.
Hello?
Okay.
We're going to continue in 1 second.
All right, thank you, sir.
All right, so 296, 2020 has carried, officially moving as racism as a public health crisis. And it will now proceed to committee as a whole on Wednesday, where it will become law. So I want to make sure that I thank all my colleagues in the health committee. We're going to continue this call. And as we continue this call, I want to make sure that everybody knows that we still have our panelists on the phone. On the Zoom call for us for some more questions. I know Councilman Casey, as well as, I'm sorry, I apologize. I was just told by my attorneys that I have to call the roll. So Kimberly, if you could you call the roll for the 296? Could you call the roll,
Griffin?
Kimberly? Yes.
McCormick,
Yes.
Conwell,
Yes.
Hairston,
Yes.
Bashir Jones,
Yes.
Santana,
Yes.
Zone.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, there are 7 yeas, 0 nays on resolution 296-2020.
Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate all of your support from the Health Committee. Remember, this call is not over. I have Councilman Casey, and if you have any questions about how this will look to our panelists, how we're going to proceed, and then after everybody has their questions, or any council members has any questions, I will proceed to tell you what the next steps are. So that being said, Councilman Casey, and then I believe Councilman Conwell would like to be back on the agenda as well. Councilman Casey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You're able to hear me?
Yes.
All right. Since I've been on council, 2015, I've had 2 opportunities to present myself in the community that was extremely unsettling for me at the beginning. I was asked to speak at the West Park Baptist Church on a Sunday afternoon one time. And then I was asked to speak at a St. Paul AME church service. Both times when I walked into those services, I was the only person who looked like me. And I can tell you that it was unsettling at the beginning. It was unnerving. But by the time it was over, it was the most enlightening experiences that I think I've ever had being on council. Pastor Greg Thomas, who's the pastor of St. Paul's AME, himself and I have had a lot of conversations regarding race and inequities that happen on the west side of Cleveland. And you know, there's one thing that he would always say to me, and he says, you know, there has to be an acknowledgement of wrong in any reconciliation. And I hope that this legislation is the beginning of that acknowledgement of wrong that has occurred not only in this city but across the country and the world. And he always reminds me that any man's death diminishes me because I'm involved in mankind. And that was a quote by Martin Luther King. So I wanted to just kind of share those experiences that I've had two opportunities to be on the other side of how I couldn't imagine how it would feel being the only person who is not like everybody else in a room, and having the extreme pleasure of being able to be accepted and to be made to feel comfortable by the time the whole thing was over. And it really was an honor and a privilege, and it's probably been the two highlights of my council careers, of things that are in the community. So when we all do get together and we decide that, you know, what's good for one is good for the other, and you know, close our eyes and forget, you know, color and race and everything else, and just start working together as human beings, I believe that the city and the country and the world are going to be a much better place. So I look forward to any type of work that needs to be done when it comes to the follow-up on this legislation, and I'm extremely supportive. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much, Councilman Casey. Appreciate your support for this as well. I do have Charles. I apologize. I have Charles Slife, and then I have Majority Leader Phyllis Cleveland. So, Mr. Slife, you have the floor.
Thank you, and I'm not a member of the committee, but thank you, Mr. Chair, for hosting this and allowing me to sit in. About 10 years ago or so, I was overseas for work in a developing country, and I remember being pretty shocked at seeing extreme poverty right next to extreme affluence, and just thinking, how could this occur, and how is this tolerated? And when I came home, I really started to see that there wasn't a phenomenon just elsewhere. It exists here. And, you know, that experience among many has really made me reflect over time about, you know, my own life and my own experience. And, you know, the fact that the class I graduated with in high school was over 95% white. Why was that? You know, and, you know, the public university that I went to in Ohio was overwhelmingly white, far greater than Ohio is generally, not proportional to our state. Why is that? And you know, honestly, I went to grade school for a few years in the South and learned a lot of things about the Civil War that aren't true, about what the causes were, and trying to really insert some rhetoric that I think would is pretty appalling in hindsight. That, you know, I learned that as a kid. And I bring that all up because throughout this process, you know, what excites me about this legislation is that there's a lot of vocabulary that I've learned over time, and I think it creates an opportunity for other people to learn it. So things like social determinants of health, and you know, disparate impact versus disparate intent, and structural racism, and really racism as a public health crisis. All of them are ways to define this phenomenon that I think we all appreciate, some more so than others, based on lived experience. And to me, if we want to ever diagnose an illness, we have to be able to define it. And to me, this is the beginning of us pushing forward our ability to diagnose. And as we diagnose, then the next step is, of course, the treatment. And as many of my colleagues have said, this is just the beginning of a process. I'm eager to be involved in that treatment of the illness. And I'm just very happy at this opportunity to continue to learn more and more about this systemic problem that we're all a part of, but that we didn't necessarily, that none of us chose to be a part of, but that we nevertheless have to resolve. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Slife, and thank you for your support. And you gave a very good summation of why this is a public health crisis, because we're looking at it from a public health point of view. So really gave a great explanation for that. Next up, I have Councilwoman Phyllis Cleveland, and then I have Councilman Kevin Conwell, who wanted to rejoin the discussion. Councilwoman Cleveland.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and to my colleagues, all of our guests this morning. Just a couple of things, a couple of comments. I will try to be brief. And also, I will try to pose a question to our presenters because I appreciate them taking the time to do the work that they do and to be here this morning, when we all have so much on our collective and individual plates. My first comment is relating to why we look at racism as a public health issue. And I think we've had some discussion about that, but I think we all need to keep in mind that although all of us are enlightened and engaged and educated, the entire community is not on the same page. And we will need to answer that question, for members of our community, residents, stakeholders, business holders. They will need to understand why we are making this declaration and why it is important, not only to us, but to them as well. A couple of things I want to point out. When we look at the public health crisis, we can just look at two things. Of course, the coronavirus, COVID-19, which we are still actively in the middle of. It has not been made obsolete. It is still here and it is still strong. And we will need to deal with that and the things that we need to do to maintain our health and maintain the health of the community from that perspective, as well as grappling and working with this issue and other issues we face. There's an old expression that my grandmother used to say, when white America gets a cold, Black America gets pneumonia. And we've seen that with Corona, we've seen that with the opioid crisis. And we've seen it with many other crises. So it is important just to say that although you may not be impacted now by certain things, but eventually it will catch up with everyone. The opioid crisis, the heroin crisis goes back to the 40s, and it rears its head every decade or so. And now we found that and most recently, the opioid crisis has really hit hard in the majority white community. And so there's been a shift in our thinking as a society that it is now a public health issue as opposed to a crime issue. So again, this work we're embarking on now is very important. A couple other things, to my colleagues, I appreciate your candor and your passion. Councilman Casey, my good friend, that feeling that you've had a couple of times, most of us Black people, have all the time. And I mean, all the time. I can't tell you how many rooms I've been in where I've been the only Black person and maybe the only Black woman, or among one or two. And that has happened, for me. And I know Ms. Mitchell, you're nodding. If Marsha Maccabee is still on the call, I know she can nod. These are experiences that we've had, since we were, young women, if not even teenagers. And so, and it is very dissettling. It can be, hard to do, but you can do it. We can all do it, and we all have to do it in order to make this work. And I will also say too that, we've got to work together. We've got to win over people, or at least open the ears and minds of people who may not see this or view this as we do. And we have to understand though, it's okay to see color. you know, we're all different, we're all diverse, we all have different cultures and upbringings, and that's fine. That's the beauty of humanity. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what we do have to grapple with is the systems that are in place, that have been set up intentionally in some cases and happen organically in other instances, but that have been set up to prefer one group of people over another, you know, strictly because of their race. And so, you know, that's the core of this work. And just a couple of other real short comments. I didn't mean to take this long, Mr. Chairman, but you know, this is hard. This is going to be hard. You know, we all come from different places. You know, we may have some bitter fights about this, but I think ultimately we will come out in a better place for the residents of the city of Cleveland, and ultimately that's what we're charged to do. One last thing I will mention. You know, we soldier on every day. We do what we do. But I read a very interesting article last night, and I just wanted to throw that out. And I want to suggest, particularly, you know, my white colleagues read this. It's called "Dear White People, Your Black Colleagues Are Not Okay." And, you know, again, I encourage you to read it all. You know, we're going to soldier on. You know, we're going to work hard. But, you know, we've been wounded. We've been wounded again. And we'll keep going, and we'll heal and we'll scar over, but those wounds take their toll. So, you know, we're okay. You know, we'll continue to smile, we'll continue to work, continue to do what we do. But, you know, I expect this process to be hard. If it was easy, you know, then, you know, we'll end up with that document sitting on the shelf next to the Ark of the Covenant. So, again, my colleagues, I'm in with you. And of course, you know, Mr. Chairman, whatever you need me to do, I am there for you and for all my colleagues. And just, again, now to my question, and this is mainly to our speakers, or though, you know, to anyone else who may be able to answer. I know other cities have embarked on this work already. And I just wanted to know if any one of you here has any idea on what that has looked like in other cities. You know, what types of, you know, what are they doing? You know, it's helpful to look at what's been done. You know, we will do our own work, but it's helpful to look at what's already been done. It may help us and clarify some things for us. Thank you.
Any other panelists? Ms. Mitchell, you had the floor. Could somebody make sure we unmute her? Okay, go ahead, Ms. Mitchell.
Thank you, Councilwoman. I think that there is a definite roadmap in a number of cities that we can look to. King County and Seattle has certainly done a lot of work. I know that the chairman is very familiar with their roadmap. And the councilman also referenced GARE, Government Alliance for Racial Equity. They are part of an organization that can help support us putting that roadmap together. But as others have said, it is important for us to engage the community in this work, to begin to look at different areas that public health touches, whether it's health or education or housing, and begin to create which often already exists, that data and that data disaggregated, and begin to understand what policies we can begin to pursue. Most policies do not call out racism. They're more subtle than that, more dangerous than that. And so we have to understand how all of the policies, the outcomes of the policies, have an impact on Black and Brown people and people of color. Creating an accreditation system, a rating system around all of the areas that touch public health will be an important way for us to track and understand. But to begin to, if we could just look at criminal justice for a minute and understand what justice reforms can be put in place in our city, and then make recommendations around calling for national standards of policing. There's just so much work, and the work groups will begin to tackle these different areas. We'll need to, if you will, in a pool, have different streams and different swim lanes all working on different areas. And this is really important. You know, we've had a conversation about the history, but you know, when we look at the Civil War, the South lost, and yet they immediately go to work around changing the dynamics of that history. We know that the Confederacy, they built monuments. It's so important. The work of changing the narrative and the policies are so important. And we see how they put monuments and practices and policies in place. You would think that they won. The GI Bill is another great example of where you had a group of people who were lost and left behind, and the psyche not only of putting a GI Bill in place, but having practice and policy around housing and healthcare to lift up the GIs in a special way so that they could get a leg up. What you had happen, even though the GI Bill was a federal law, we know that it could be interpreted locally. And so Black and brown soldiers did not have the same level of access. And so it is important. Equity is not about giving everybody the same. Structural racism is about a set of rules and norms that we all play by. And so the hard, almost impossible task that we are taking on is to go in and start digging out these pieces. But we know that this is absolutely critical, but it is going to, the challenge is so great. It would be easy to want to give up, but we must soldier on. And, you know, we saw what the Confederacy did. You know, these young white men for generations were elevated and feel proud of what happened there. And the same for the GI Bill. And so we must, we must soldier on. So the roadmaps are there, but it is going to be difficult. And as Danielle Sidnor said, we've all got to be able to find our place in the work, and there will be plenty to do. But I like to think of it as swim lanes. I like to think of it as GARE being able to help these roadmaps. And King County, we know that Milwaukee is several steps ahead of us. But we will have to step behind the plow once again and till new soil in this work. Thank you.
I believe Ms. Maccabee had a response to that as well. Ms. Maccabee? Is Marsha Maccabee? Could we make sure we unmute Marsha Maccabee? All right, Councilwoman, while we're getting Marsha back up and running, did you have any follow-up, Councilwoman?
No, that's it.
Okay, I'm unmuted now.
Okay, there you go, Marsha.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to add the fact that I knew that Ms. Mitchell had a lot of the history and on what had happened in other places. But what I wanted to add is going forward, there's something that's going to be to our advantage, to my councilwoman, kudos to my councilwoman. The fact that there is a lot of planning going on for post-COVID recovery. Those planning sessions, and I've been sitting in a lot of them, there's a lot of conversation about making sure that systems issues are being addressed. So that puts us in a very good place because systems issues are the things that are going to have to be addressed around making racism a public health crisis. So I think that one of the things that we all should keep in mind is when we're in rooms where the discussions are occurring around post-COVID strategies, we should be making a connection and an alignment to this work because it can be done simultaneously, I think, which will make it even easier for us to, really get into those systems and call the questions. If it had just been based on the racism piece, we may encounter more resistance, but because we're also looking at post-COVID strategies for putting, or really someone said, really reclaiming our communities. Many have said we didn't have equal communities to start with, so it's about developing equal communities in many cases now.
Thank you, Ms. Mockaby. I also have Natoya Walker Minor who wanted to make a comment regarding that question. Chief Walker Minor.
Sure, can you hear me?
Yes.
I just wanted to say that there are several cities now that are doing this work. Most recently in our state, the city of Columbus has just moved to that about 10 days ago. Milwaukee is doing this type of work, but I first learned about this work from the city of Seattle. And the city of Seattle has been doing this work for 15 years. They started doing this work back in 2005. There was mounting pressure in that city, like other cities across this country, and they began to do this work. And they really are, they set the level field, they set the playing field for how this work should be done. And each of those persons that did that work in that city at that time are now training nationally across this country in cities on what to do and how to do it. It's already been said that this won't be easy. It won't be easy. It isn't easy, because if it were easy, it would have been done, because it makes you have to look at things differently. Where do you, where are we going to park our public works vehicles? What are the air emissions that emit from X? Whose community is going to receive X? So as we think about, and this is where I think the work between the administration and city council, when we start thinking about our structures and our systems and our decision making, we have to think about, well, if we build here, who has access to something that someone may not have access to? We have to think about, when we build, is there public transportation? What's the access point? So it makes us have to peel back the onion that much more intentionally. So this work is intentional work. It's an intentional, which means it will slow down processes that are already slow, right? In very large bureaucracies that are always under the eye of public records. So it's going to make us have to do that work, but we know that it has happened. We have the roadmap in Seattle. Milwaukee is in year 2, maybe 3 of their work. Pittsburgh just began. Boston is exploring this now. So our larger counterpart cities are looking at this work, but it's a level of intentionality at the decision-making around where programs will be planted, which communities are doing what, and oftentimes we operate from a ward boundary basis. And this is not ward boundary basis. This is how and where the implications impact Clevelanders. And that's a different lens. That's a paradigm shift in the way that ward-based councils typically work. But we have a model in our first year Cleveland work. We have a model in the work that we have completed around lead, because that's what it's looking at. It's allowing the data to direct the resources, financial, human, and other, to generate the impact to improve and elevate the levers of opportunity and equity across the city. And those are not based on geographical lines. We have to look at the city from the global context, right? The 78 square miles of the city, and how do we improve equity for Cleveland, not Ward 1, not Ward 5, not Ward 6, not Ward, 1 through 17, but Cleveland. And so that's a different lens for the elected officials on the city council side of the hall, because you have pressures around, the geographical footprint that you represent. And so that narrative is there, and that becomes a stronghold when good is what you want to do. But again, I think that we have the example in Seattle, because we know that the example in Seattle has been tested, it's been tried, and now it's being replicated.
All right. I know that Councilman Brancatelli wanted to make a point, but I think he had to step out. So I'm going back to Councilman Kevin Conwell, who had a follow-up question and comment he wanted to make. Councilman Kevin Conwell.
I'll be brief. I was listening to Chief Walker Minor. I would like to see the paper that she was narrating about Seattle, as well as Milwaukee and Pittsburgh, because you look at lessons learned. So I think it can help us out with that. So, Mr. Chairman, is there a way that we can get the paper, because we need to study it?
So, Chief, do you
You
have
hear
that
me?
document? I will also tell you that Ann Tilley has researched and pulled some documentation together. So she has some documents that describe what it is. So she has that. I think she sent it to all council members already. We'll follow up with that. And Chief, do you have what Councilman Conwell is asking you for?
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
I don't have a document from Seattle. I've been in several webinars over the last 10 years with Seattle, so I know their model well. What I would recommend to the chair is that as the work group is formulated and formally established, that in my opinion, in my career, what has always worked for me is I look at best practice cities and I conduct interviews, focus groups with them to learn what worked, what didn't, what did you have to redirect. And so as we move forward, I would recommend that we coordinate calls with Seattle, with Baltimore, with Milwaukee, with Columbus, with Boston. What are the hurdles that you have overcome and how did you do that? What should we be looking for? Because to Councilman Conwell's point, there is no one roadmap. There are best practices and lessons learned. And I think that in order for us to get it right is to talk to those that have did this work before us, to learn, to glean, to adapt, right? And to really think about how do we make and own Cleveland's from the footprint of those that have gone before us. And that's how we bring people in. And whomever is will be, the work group will be comprised of, to really think about what that means and how this will impact us. So Councilman Conwell, I can pull something from the city of Seattle from the internet because they have their stories written. And I've also met and been in conversation with those original leaders because they're out there training across the country. But the reality is we all need to collectively do our homework around this. I think Councilman Griffin, as chair, you will be in the position to coordinate these calls across the country. And then we go deep to ask the questions, and not surface questions. We have to ask sticky widget questions. Where are the traps? Where are the walking time bombs? And how did you get around that so that we can be smart about this work? And this can't become politicized. This is real work because what we have witnessed over the last few days is, Langston Hughes said it best. What happens and what we have witnessed is an explosion of suppression, an explosion of suppression that dates back. Dr. James talked about 400 years, but it's been 157 years since the Emancipation Proclamation. And liberty and equity are designed as twins, but they aren't. They just aren't. And so what we have witnessed is what happens when a dream is deferred. It explodes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chief. Councilman?
Council Chairman, when you reach out for the proposals, you have to always, we look at milestones and goals and objectives. I want to see the evaluation process. How are they evaluating where they're going? Progress reviews, those kind of things. So that way you learn lessons learned from the evaluation process. A good evaluation process is worth its weight in gold. It can tell us what's going on. That way we can evaluate it, because we're going to need to put systems in place to evaluate also. So we need the proposal as well as the evaluation process. I want to read both so we can measure goals and objectives. I want to switch gears to, is it Dr. James? Is he here, one of the panelists?
Yes, Dr. James is here.
Growing up as a kid, I've always experienced racism. And as you know, when you first met me, Mr. Chairman, and I continue to be an activist now, I was an activist in the community. And the reason why is because of the racism. And it's well documented that I couldn't even walk in my own ward. And I dealt with that with some policy with them, and I'll continue to keep fighting. But let me get to my point. The Dred Scott decision. The Supreme Court passed that the abolitionists, they want to question freedom for African Americans. And the Supreme Court said, I think it was in 1861, that a black man doesn't have the right that a free man must respect. Meaning free men are Europeans, white men. And is the Dred Scott decision still on the books with the Supreme Court? If so, then we need to push resolution to try to fight against that also, because the Dred Scott decision is baked into everything that that they do, all their policies. So the question to Dr. James, is the Dred Scott decision still on the book?
Dr. James?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't know the specific answer to that question, although I think our conversation this morning would pretty strongly suggest that whether or not the Dred Scott decision is still officially on the books, that racism is alive and doing well in this country. I'll use as a recent example, besides the stuff that Mrs. Mitchell and others have talked about this morning, I'll use as a recent example the coroner's report for George Floyd, which implies that despite the video that showed his neck being stepped on and 3 policemen holding him down, the coroner's report implies that perhaps underlying medical conditions like hypertension or coronary artery disease may have been the reasons that he died, along with possible intoxicants. It was racism that killed Mr. Floyd. We need to stand clear on that. The implication that it wasn't him being suffocated, or possibly wasn't him being suffocated, and that there were other contributing reasons is in my opinion crazy. The suggestion would be that if he had been shot in the head with a gun, that it wasn't the shooting in the head that was the reason for his death, but these underlying medical conditions. We need to be very clear about how racism is working in our country, working in Cleveland, and being very intentional about our efforts to change that. Ms. Mitchell mentioned that what happened after the Civil War. What I've suggested in some of my talks is that the North won the Civil War, but that the South has won the peace. And that's why we're still struggling today, because those sentiments very prevalent in the South, preserving the Southern way of life, have prevailed throughout our country, and it's an issue that we're still fighting. Everybody has said, moving forward, this is going to be extremely difficult work, but we have no choice except to fight this fight, to win this fight, because if we don't, we give a very dire future to our children and our grandchildren, and that just can't be the case.
Councilman?
You know, I'm going to end. Let me say this, council member, chairman, what the coroner said, they're going to have get an independent one also to come in to review this last coroner's finding. When is he elected? And I know we can't get into politics, but you got to vote those people out, man. We got to vote. We have to do that, just like we did with McGinty, and just like what we did with John O'Donnell. As I mentioned earlier, actions speak louder than words. You have to vote them out. And we march is good, because marching shines the light on issues. However, the power of voting is very, very important. And we must get together. We can get there to march, but we have to vote out people who are not helping people out. So, I mean, that's where I'm at. And we created the blueprint when we voted McGinty out of office as the prosecutor, and we created the blueprint when we did not let John O'Donnell become the Supreme Court justice. And we're going to have to do that again with him, to not let him get in. And that's where I'm at with that. Thank you very much. And God bless.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Councilman. The last remark, and then I'm going to close out because I'm losing folks, is going to be Marsha Maccabee, and then I'll close with next steps, okay?
Yes.
All right, cool beans.
To Councilman through the chair, I just wanted to share with you all that on a National Urban League call last night, Ben Crump joined us, who is, of course, representative counsel for the family. And he told us, as a matter of fact, the independent autopsy was being completed over the weekend. And while he could not share any of the details with us yet, he indicated that there would be some interesting findings coming out as a result of that. And so we're kind of holding with bated breath to hear, what the results of that will be. There's also been a change in hands in who's going to be handling the case in Minnesota. And he shared with us that the change in the hands of who's handling that there was a lot of confidence in the community about who was going to be handling that. So I hope to see some encouraging turns as things begin to move forward in that case. But wanted to share with you that that came directly from Attorney Crump just last night when we spoke with him.
Thank you so much, Ms. Maccabee. I don't see any more hands. Therefore, I want to move to end this Committee of Health and Human Services. Once this passes through committee as a whole, just to let you know what the next steps is, that we will be convening and working closely with a lot of the work groups. There are a lot of people working in this space. Equity has been front and center with major organizations. I don't want to miss that the United Way through Helen Forbes has convened a working group as well that has worked focused on equity and equitable practices. And she's been working with the United Black Fund. There's everybody in town is really focused on trying to do a lot of this work. But as a council, our job is to really try to weave it all together so that at the end of the day, our citizens and our residents can touch, feel, see, and taste the change that we really want to try to have happen. We don't want this to just be on paper. Everybody continues to ask, what does this mean? What are you going to do? I think our panelists eloquently stated what this work means, what it will do, and the outcomes that we experience. It is going to be a work in progress. It's not going to be something that everybody's going to address today. And let's face it, that racism is a sickness. It is a sickness and it is an illness. That's why we're looking at this from a public health approach. The CDC says, and I want to acknowledge the director of health, Merle Gordon, because this is where I got the definition. The Centers for Disease Control says, whenever you make a declaration about something being a public health crisis, you then have to put the systems in place in order to eradicate the illness or eradicate the public health crisis. And we know that public health is about protecting and improving the health of people, entire populations, and communities. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make sure that we have a healthier Cleveland. And we know in order to have a healthier Cleveland, we have to declare racism as a public health crisis because it is something that is ripping our community apart. It manifested this weekend. So I urge everybody to not just pass this, but be involved with this. The work is going to be critical. I do want to tell everybody that I have been in conversations with Chantel Brown, the county councilwoman, and she is looking at putting something together at the county level that supports this. I have been in conversation with several other mayors as well as council people from across the state. I've talked to the National Black Caucus of Elected Officials. They are looking at how they can push this movement. I've talked with Tara Samples and also Russell Neal from Akron, and Akron is looking at pushing this forward. And I'm also excited that the state is going to be announcing their resolution tomorrow. Stephanie House, who is our state representative, is going to be teaming up with some folks from Columbus to announce it at the State House, as well as in the Senate. And Sandra Williams, and at the Senate side, is going to be introducing it at the State House. In addition, I have talked to the Ohio Democratic Party Chairman, David Pepper, and their executive committee is looking at taking this up this Saturday as well. So everybody is moving towards this. This is a movement. Cleveland has always been at the forefront. I will close with this. The public health director got together with the safety director in 1945 and created the Community Relations Board in the city of Cleveland. It is the oldest human relations board in the United States of America. However, as always, I think that we have lost our focus in the city of Cleveland, and nobody has ever truly recognized racism as a public health crisis. And we really need to make sure that we tie all of these folks in that really are working in this space, because we don't want this to be something that is just a passing fancy. We want this to be institutionalized. So no matter who's mayor, no matter who's council person, no matter what shape or form of city government, that these things are institutionalized. I will also encourage everybody, my partners included, to really reach out to the corporate and civic agencies, because they're going to have to also be a part of this movement. It can't just be the city of Cleveland. We're all going to have to be a better Cleveland. That being said, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you for the audience, the listening audience. This council stands together against racism, and we totally support this issue. Thank you so much, and we look forward to doing the work. This Committee of Health and Human Services is now adjourned.